Hello, welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. We have another 3 stories for you today. Doing my job. No overtime allowed. And insurance plays silly buggers, pays through the nose. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Alright, let's get started. Our first story. Doing my job. Okay, I am really bad at recounts, so I will try to keep this quite brief. Basically, I was working casually for a pizza chain, the one that you can't get out of, and I had to call out for a shift to go to the hospital as I was the victim of some domestic violence and injured my arm. The managers were fine with it, although out of the 4 I spoke to, none of them asked if I was okay, but that's a different matter. I went to the hospital and the doctor looked at it and just put a band-aid over the wounds in my arm and said not to do any heavy lifting and use my arm as little as possible for a couple of days. I questioned whether he could just glue the wound or stitch it, but he refused. I have no idea why it 100% needed to be glued, and my regular doctor said much the same when I showed the injuries to him nearly 2 weeks later, as they still hadn't healed. But after I got to my house from the hospital, I rang my store manager and told him I would only be able to do light duties for a couple of weeks, knowing the doctor at the hospital was wrong, and he said that was not a problem and that he appreciated that I was still willing to work. Anyways, I went back to work 2 days after the injuries occurred. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have been going to work, but I needed money and wasn't going to have any otherwise. As soon as I got there, the manager, not the store manager, let's call them Tammy, told me I would be on dispatch, cutting and boxing all the pizzas and sides. I apologized and explained I wouldn't be able to do that as the pans can get quite heavy and the doctor had asked me to not use that arm. I also showed her the bandage I had wrapped my arm in. Tammy asked why I even came to work that day, and I explained that I had told the store manager about my circumstances, and they had been happy for me to do light duties. Tammy rolled her eyes and told me to answer the phones and serve customers instead, which I was happy to do. We got quite busy, and dishes started piling up, so Tammy told me to get on washing up. I reminded her of my arm and suggested it probably wasn't a good idea to put a fresh wound that was still bleeding slightly in water that was being used to clean dishes. Tammy rolled her eyes and said she was going to the office, she would be back in 20 minutes, and that I had better have done all the dishes and put them away. I tried to explain that I wouldn't be able to lift the fresh out of the oven pans into the sink to wash, but she ignored me and said my arm couldn't be that bad or the doctor would have glued the wound or given me stitches, and that she wanted the work done. Cue the MC. I started doing the dishes and was very careful to only lift an amount that I could handle with one hand, despite it not being very safe. 10 minutes later, Tammy yelled out that I wasn't moving fast enough and that I needed to use 2 hands, so I lifted up a larger pile that I could usually carry quite easily with 2 hands, but in this case my arm went numb, and I dropped them and in reflex tried to catch them, which completely busted the wounds open and blood started dripping everywhere. I quickly bandaged my arm again and cleaned up the blood, but one of the customers had started yelling that I needed help. Tammy came and told me to move out of her way. She then spent the rest of the night cleaning the dishes, as the store manager had checked the cameras and seen me doing the dishes and told her they needed to be redone with clean water, and I continued doing the light duties I'd been assigned, aside from a number of admin tasks that I normally did, which she, for some reason, refused to allow me to do. I found out later Tammy didn't go home until 1 a.m. and kept 2 other staff there to help her when we closed at 10 because she wasn't able to get her work, plus the work she refused to let me do, done on time. Sorry if this is poorly written or doesn't sound like the typical MC. I promise it was because I'm just really bad at recounts. Our next story. No overtime allowed. My employer had started a 0 overtime rule for a couple months to try and avoid paying overtime. Well, in order to comply with this rule, I unfortunately have to leave a job partly unfinished, but I could get right back to it the next day and finish it quite quickly. I get back to work the next day, and my boss, Mike, needs to see me right away. He asked me why I had left a task unfinished, and I reminded him about the 0 overtime. I didn't understand the issue. I clocked out on time and intended to finish my task the next day. Well, Mike told me he had gotten a complaint from his boss, Jerry, about the unfinished task. Apparently, it was a task that needed to be completed on the day it had been assigned, but I was not informed of this. Mike knew I had not been informed of the task needing to be completed the same day because he was the one who had assigned me the task and never told me it needed to be completed that same day. Well, this explanation did not sit well with Jerry. He wanted me written up for leaving the task unfinished. But Mike pointed out the 0 overtime rule and asked Jerry what would have happened had I gotten overtime, and Jerry apparently said I would have been written up for getting overtime, and he did not understand why he needed to explain that. I was not written up and did not get in trouble. But it was interesting how Jerry seemed to think he could have it both ways. No overtime or you get written up, but if you have to get overtime to finish a task, then you get written up. I was injured and assigned certain duties that would avoid impacting my injuries, and an irresponsible manager made me disregard that decision, making more work for herself. Sorry, I evidently really suck at being brief and I apologize now for any formatting or grammar errors. E2, I realized my brain went too fast for my typing and I missed a couple of words. And our last story. Insurance plays silly buggers, pays through the nose. Edit to add a trigger warning for the squeamish amongst us. In 1996, I needed a corneal transplant. It was an outpatient surgery, but the problem was that insurance would not pay for outpatient surgeries, only for surgeries that required at least 3 days of hospitalization. When I told my ophthalmologist that, he just smiled and booked me into the hospital for 3 days. Insurance paid for that corneal transplant and the 4 that followed in the next 11 months. My body consistently rejected them. I still smile over how much extra they paid because of their stupid rule. They also had to pay for the time the stitches came undone, and my eye started leaking. Instead of being in a day surgery center for a few hours, that also necessitated a 3-day hospital stay. Edited to add this was in South Africa, not the USA. Well, that's all for this video. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next one.